Hello, welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. Things look different. It is actually the future. I have re-recorded today's video and next week's video because we lost all of it. We lost all of it. So, a little flash into the future. Things are different. Don't be scared. But here we are. So, let's just scoop right into this, shall we? Oh yeah, and because I'm re-recording this, it's not live on Twitch, so we're not gonna get chat messages over here. Little Bean's not gonna be fed, unfortunately, but just little things to let you know as we go forward. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do this. Chapter 8. After the attack. It was now about 3 a.m., and presently the eastern sky began to pale with the coming of dawn. Gradually the day came, and by its light I scanned the gardens earnestly, but nowhere could I see any signs of the brutes. I leaned over and glanced down to the foot of the wall to see whether the body of the thing I had shot the night before was still there. It was gone. I supposed that others of the monsters had removed it during the night. Then I went down to the roof and crossed over to the gap from which the coping stone had fallen. Reaching it, I looked over. Yes, there was the stone, as I had seen it last, but there was no appearance of anything beneath it, nor could I see the creatures I had killed after its fall. Evidently, they also had been taken away. I turned and went down to my study. There, I sat down wearily. I was thoroughly tired. It was quite light now, though the sun's rays were not, as yet, perceptibly hot. A clock chimed the hour of 4. I awoke with a start and looked round hurriedly. The clock in the corner indicated that it was 3 o'clock. It was already afternoon. I must have slept for nearly 11 hours. With a jerky movement, I sat forward in the chair and listened. The house was perfectly silent. Slowly, I stood up and yawned. I felt desperately tired, still, and sat down again, wondering what it was that had waked me. It must have been the clock striking, I concluded presently, and was commencing to doze off, when a sudden noise brought me back once more to life. It was the sound of a step, as of a person moving cautiously down the corridor toward my study. In an instant, I was on my feet and grasping my rifle. Noiselessly, I waited. Had the creatures broken in whilst I slept? Even as I questioned, the steps reached my door, halted momentarily, and then continued down the passage. Silently, I tiptoed to the doorway and peeped out. Then I experienced such a feeling of relief as much a reprieved criminal. It was my sister. She was going toward the stairs. I stepped into the hall and was about to call to her when it occurred to me that it was very odd she should have crept past my door in that stealthy manner. I was puzzled, and for one brief moment the thought occupied my mind that it was not she, but some fresh mystery of the house. Then, as I caught a glimpse of her petticoat, the thought passed as quickly as it had come, and I half laughed. There could be no mistaking that ancient garment. Yes, I wondered what she was doing, and, remembering her condition of mind on the previous day, I felt that it might be best to follow, quietly, taking care not to alarm her, and see what she was going to do. If she behaved rationally, well and good. If not, I should have to take steps to restrain her. I could run No unnecessary risks under the danger that threatened us. Quickly, I reached the head of the stairs and paused a moment. Then, I heard a sound that sent me leaping down at a mad rate. It was the rattle of bolts being unshot. That foolish sister of mine was actually unbarring the back door. Just as her hand was on the last bolt, I reached her. She had not seen me, and the first thing she knew, I had hold of her arm. She glanced up quickly, like a frightened animal, and screamed aloud. "Come, Mary," I said sternly. "What's the meaning of this nonsense? Do you mean to tell me you don't understand the danger that you try to throw our 2 lives away in this fashion?" To this, she replied nothing, and only trembled, violently, gasping and sobbing as though in the last extremity of fear. Through some minutes, I reasoned with her, pointing out the need for caution and asking her to be brave. There was little to be afraid of now, I explained, and I tried to believe that I spoke the truth. But she must be sensible, and not attempt to leave the house for a few days. At last, I ceased in despair. It was no use talking to her. She was obviously not quite herself for the time being. Finally, I told her she had better go to her room if she could not behave rationally. Still, she took no notice. So, without more ado, I picked her up in my arms and carried her there. At first, she screamed wildly, but had relapsed into silent trembling by the time I reached the stairs. Arriving at her room, I laid her upon the bed. She lay there quietly enough, neither speaking nor sobbing, just shaking in a very ague of fear. I took a rug from a chair nearby and spread it over her. I could do nothing more for her, and so crossed to where Pepper lay in a big basket. My sister had taken charge of him since his wound, to nurse him, for it had proved more severe than I had thought, and I was pleased to note that, in spite of her state of mind, she had looked after the old dog carefully. Stooping, I spoke to him, and, in reply, he licked my hand feebly. He was too ill to do more. Then, going to the bed, I bent over my sister and asked her how she felt. But she only shook the more, and, much as it pained me, I had to admit that my presence seemed to make her worse. And so, I left her, locking the door and pocketing the key. It seemed to be the only course to take. The rest of the day I spent between the tower and my study. For food, I brought up a loaf from the pantry, and on this, and some claret, I lived for that day. What a long, weary day it was. If only I could have gone out into the gardens, as is my wont, I should have been content enough. But to be cooped in this silent house with no companion save a mad woman and a sick dog was enough to prey upon the nerves of the hardiest. And out in the tangled shrubberies that surrounded the house lurked, for all I could tell, those infernal swine creatures waiting their chance. Was ever a man in such straits? Once, in the afternoon, and again later, I went to visit my sister. The second time, I found her tending Pepper, but at my approach she slid over unobtrusively to the far corner, with a gesture that saddened me beyond belief. Poor girl. Her fear cut me intolerably, and I would not intrude on her unnecessarily. She would be better, I trusted, in a few days. Meanwhile, I could do nothing, and I judged it still needful, hard as it seemed, to keep her confined to her room. One thing there was that I took for encouragement. She had eaten some of the food I had taken to her on my first visit. And so the day passed. As the evening drew on, the air grew chilly, and I began to make preparations for passing a second night in the tower, taking up 2 additional rifles and a heavy ulster. The rifles I loaded and laid alongside my other, as I intended to make things warm for any of the creatures who might show during the night. I had plenty of ammunition, and I thought to give the brutes such a lesson as should show them the uselessness of attempting to force an entrance. After that, I made the round of the house again, paying particular attention to the props that supported the study door. Then, feeling that I had done all that lay in my power to ensure our safety, I returned to the tower, calling in on my sister and Pepper for a final visit on the way. Pepper was asleep, but woke as I entered and wagged his tail in recognition. I thought he seemed slightly better. My sister was lying on the bed, though whether asleep or not, I was unable to tell, and thus I left them. Reaching the tower, I made myself as comfortable as circumstances would permit, and settled down to watch through the night. Gradually, darkness fell, and soon the details of the gardens were merged into shadows. During the first few hours, I sat, alert, listening for any sound that might help to tell me if anything were stirring down below. It was far too dark for my eyes to be of much use. Slowly, the hours passed, without anything unusual happening, and the moon rose, showing the gardens apparently empty and silent. And so, through the night, without disturbance or sound. Toward morning, I began to grow stiff and cold with my long vigil. Also, I was getting very uneasy concerning the continued quietness on the part of the creatures. I mistrusted it, and would sooner far have had them attack the house openly. Then, at least, I should have known my danger, and been able to meet it, but to wait like this, through a whole night, picturing all kinds of unknown devilment, was to jeopardize one's sanity. Once or twice, the thought came to me that perhaps they had gone. But in my heart, I found it impossible to believe that it was so. End of chapter 8. Okay. Chapter 8 is the aftermath of the attack that we had last time when the pigs were like trying to barge in, all of these things. We shot pigs, we did things. And then we went around and like boarded up all of the house and everything. So this is like the following bits of time. And we are still very concerned that the pigs are going to come back. We check the around the house, everything like that. There's no pig bodies, which is weird, but we just assume that, you know, the one that we shot had been pulled away from the other creatures. So that's fine. That's fine. That's easily explainable. Our sister's being weird. I can't explain it. It's definitely not us losing our sanity. It's definitely our sister losing our sanity, for sure, for sure. Pepper is still wounded. Poor little Peppers. Poor little Pipple. And being slowly taken care of by our sister. I'm just imagining our sister's point of view. And, like, I'm thinking she's not seeing the things that we're seeing. She's just seeing her brother slowly, well, not even slowly at this point, but aggressively decline into this manic state. So yeah, we are in the waiting period, patiently waiting, but ready for the next attack, and it's slowly driving us crazy. That's what's driving us crazy, is the waiting, not seeing the pigs or traveling through space and time or any of that. No, no, no. The wait is the thing that's driving us crazy. Definitely. All right. Chapter 9. In the cellars. At last, What with being tired and cold, and the uneasiness that possessed me, I resolved to take a walk through the house, first calling in at the study for a glass of brandy to warm me. This I did, and while there, I examined the door carefully, but found all as I had left it the night before. The day was just breaking as I left the tower, though it was still too dark in the house to be able to see without a light, and I took one of the study candles with me on my round. By the time I had finished the ground floor, the daylight was creeping in, wanly, through the barred windows. My search had shown me nothing fresh. Everything appeared to be in order, and I was on the point of extinguishing my candle, when the thought suggested itself to me to have another glance round the cellars. I had not, if I remember rightly, been into them since my hasty search on the evening of the attack. What are we gonna find? For perhaps the half of a minute, I hesitated. I would have been very willing to forego the task, as indeed I am inclined to think any man well might, for of all the great, awe-inspiring rooms in this house, the cellars are the hugest and the weirdest. Great, gloomy caverns and places, unlit by any ray of daylight. Yet I would not shirk the work. That's a fun rhyme. Shirk the work. I felt that to do so would smack of sheer cowardice. Besides, as I reassured myself, the cellars were really the most unlikely places in which to come across anything dangerous, considering that they can be entered only through a heavy oaken door, the key of which I carry always on my person. It is in the smallest of these places that I keep my wine, a gloomy hole close to the foot of the cellar stairs, and beyond which I have seldom proceeded. Indeed, save for the rummage round already mentioned, I doubt whether I had ever before been right through the cellars. As I unlocked the great door at the top of the steps, I paused nervously a moment at the strange, desolate smell that assailed my nostrils. Then, throwing the barrel of my weapon forward, I descended slowly into the darkness of the underground regions. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, I stood for a minute and listened. All was silent, save for a faint drip of water, falling, drop by drop, somewhere to my left. As I stood, I noticed how quietly the candle burnt. Never a flicker, nor flare, so utterly windless was the place. Quietly, I moved from cellar to cellar. I had but a very dim memory of their arrangement. The impressions left by my first search were blurred. I had recollections of a succession of great cellars, and of one greater than the rest, the roof of which was upheld by pillars. Beyond that, my mind was hazy and predominated by a sense of cold and darkness and shadows. Now, however, it was different, for although nervous, I was sufficiently collected to be able to look about me and note the structure and size of the different vaults I entered. Of course, with the amount of light given by my candle, it was not possible to examine each place minutely, but I was enabled to notice, as I went along, that the walls appeared to be built with wonderful precision and finish, while here and there an occasional massive pillar shot up to support the vaulted roof. Thus I came, at last, to the great cellar that I remembered. It is reached through a huge, arched entrance, on which I observed strange, fantastic carvings, which threw odd shadows under the light of my candle. As I stood and examined these thoughtfully, it occurred to me how strange it was that I should be so little acquainted with my own house. Yet, this may be easily understood when one realizes the size of this ancient pile and the fact that only my old sister and I live in it, occupying a few of the rooms such as our wants decide. Holding the light high, I passed on into the cellar and, keeping to the right, paced slowly up until I reached the further end. I walked quietly and looked cautiously about as I went, but, so far as the light showed, I saw nothing unusual. At the top, I turned to the left, still keeping to the wall, and so continued until I had traversed the whole of the vast chamber. As I moved along, I noticed that the floor was composed of solid rock, in places covered with a damp mold, in others bare, or almost so, save for a thin coating of light gray dust. I had halted at the doorway. Now, however, I turned and made my way up the center of the place, passing among the pillars and glancing to right and left as I moved. About halfway up the cellar, I stubbed my foot against something that gave out a metallic sound. Stooping quickly, I held the candle and saw that the object I had kicked was a large metal ring. Bending lower, I cleared the dust from around it and, presently, discovered that it was attached to a ponderous trap door, black with age. Feeling excited and wondering to where it could lead, I laid my gun on the floor and, sticking the candle in the trigger guard, took the ring in both hands and pulled. The trap creaked loudly, the sound echoing vaguely through the huge piece, and opened heavily. Propping the edge on my knee, I reached for the candle and held it in the opening, moving it to right and left, but could see nothing. I was puzzled and surprised. There were no signs of steps, nor even the appearance of there ever having been any. Nothing, save an empty blackness. I might have been looking down into a bottomless, sideless wall. Then, even as I stared, full of perplexity, I seemed to hear, far down, as though from untold depths, a faint whisper of sound. I bent my head quickly, more into the opening, and listened intently. It may have been fancy, but I could have sworn to hearing a soft titter that grew into a hideous chuckling, faint and distant. Startled, I leapt backward, letting the trap fall with a hollow clang that filled the place with echoes. Even then, I seemed to hear that mocking, suggestive laughter. But this, I knew, must be my imagination. The sound I had heard was far too slight to penetrate through the cumbrous trap. For a full minute, I stood there, quivering, glancing nervously behind and before. But the great cellar was silent as a grave, and gradually I shook off the frightened sensation. With a calmer mind, I began again, curious to know into what that trap opened, but could not, then, summon sufficient courage to make a further investigation. One thing, I felt, however, was that the trap ought to be secured. This I accomplished by placing upon it several large pieces of dressed stone, which I had noticed in my tour along the east wall. Then, after a final scrutiny of the rest of the place, I retraced my way through the cellars, to the stairs, and so reached the daylight with an infinite feeling of relief that the uncomfortable task was accomplished. End of chapter 9. Okay, so chapter 9. We have gone all through the house, fortifying it, preparing for what we know is going to be another attack. One place that we haven't gone is the cellars. So we go down into the cellars, and we admittedly know that this is a weird place and a scary place. But we go down there, and we're looking around. We don't really see anything until we find a trapped door. We open the trap door, and we hold our light. We're trying to look and see. We can't find anything, but we hear something. We hear a creepy little laugh, and I hate it. I hate it so much. There are several things that are terrifying. Swine people, obviously. Obviously. Laughter. Laughter is terrifying. Laughter is also joyous. Don't get me wrong. Don't you dare get me wrong. But in this context, in the dark, when we think that we're being sane, but we probably aren't, hearing laughter is a terrifying thing. And so we know that this leads somewhere, and we don't want wherever it leads to welcome the swine into our homes. So we grab a bunch of rocks that we found over at the east wall, and we make it so that that trapdoor cannot be opened from the outside. Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy. Oh boy. Okay. Scary, scary. Okay. Let's have a little sip of water first. Chapter 10. The time of waiting. I'm wondering if or when they come back. Like, if and when they come back. I don't know. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. Chapter 10. The time of waiting. The sun was now warm and shining brightly, forming a wondrous contrast to the dark and dismal cellars. And it was with comparatively light feelings that I made my way up to the tower to survey the gardens. There, I found everything quiet, and after a few minutes went down to Mary's room. Mary's our sister. Here, having knocked and received a reply, I unlocked the door. My sister was sitting quietly on the bed. That's right, I forgot. We locked our sister in her room because she's being weird and we're trying to protect her, obviously. Nothing untoward about that. My sister was sitting quietly on the bed, as though waiting. She seemed quite herself again, and made no attempt to move away as I approached. Yet I observed that she scanned my face anxiously, as though in doubt, and but half assured in her mind that there was nothing to fear from me. To my questions as to how she felt, she replied, sanely enough, that she was hungry, and would like to go down to prepare breakfast, if I did not mind. For a minute I meditated whether it would be safe to let her out. Finally, I told her she might go, on condition that she promised not to attempt to leave the house or meddle with any of the outer doors. At my mention of the doors, a sudden look of fright crossed her face, but she said nothing, save to give the required promise, and then left the room silently. Crossing the floor, I approached Pepper. He had waked as I entered, but beyond a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft rapping with his tail, he had kept quiet. Now, as I patted him, he made an attempt to stand up, and succeeded only to fall back on his side with a little yowl of pain. Pepper. I spoke to him and bade him lie still. I was greatly delighted with his improvement, and also with the natural kindness of my sister's heart in taking such good care of him, in spite of her condition of mind. After a while, I left him and went downstairs to my study. In a little time, Mary appeared, carrying a tray on which smoked a hot breakfast. As she entered the room, I saw her gaze fasten on the props that supported the study door. Her lips tightened, and I thought she paled slightly. But that was all. Putting the tray down at my elbow, she was leaving the room quietly when I called her back. She came, it seemed, a little timidly, as though startled, and I noted that her hand clutched at her apron nervously. "Come, Mary," I said. "Cheer up. Things look brighter. I've seen none of the creatures since yesterday morning, early." She looked at me in a curiously puzzled manner, as though not comprehending. Then intelligence swept into her eyes, and fear. But she said nothing, beyond an unintelligible murmur of acquiescence. After that I kept silence. It was evident that any reference to the swine things was more than her shaken nerves could bear. Breakfast over, I went up to the tower. Here, during the greater part of the day, I maintained a strict watch over the gardens. Once or twice I went down to the basement to see how my sister was getting along. Each time I found her quiet and curiously submissive. Indeed, on the last occasion she even ventured to address me on her own account with regard to some household matter that needed attention, though this was done with an almost extraordinary timidity. I hailed it with happiness, as being the first word voluntarily spoken since the critical moment when I had caught her unbarring the back door. To go out among those waiting brutes. I wondered whether she was aware of her attempt, and how near a thing it had been, but refrained from questioning her, thinking it best to let well alone. That night I slept in a bed, the first time for 2 nights. In the morning I rose early and took a walk through the house. All was as it should be, and I went up to the tower to have a look at the gardens. Here I found perfect quietness. At breakfast, when I met Mary, I was greatly pleased to see that she had sufficiently regained command over herself to be able to greet me in a perfectly natural manner. She talked sensibly and quietly, only keeping carefully from any mention of the past couple of days. In this I humored her, to the extent of not attempting to lead the conversation in that direction. Earlier in the morning, I had been to see Pepper. He was mending rapidly, and bade fair to be on his legs, in earnest, in another day or 2. Before leaving the breakfast table, I made some reference to his improvement. In the short discussion that followed, I was surprised to gather, from my sister's remarks, that she was still under the impression that his wound had been given by the wildcat of my invention. It made me feel almost ashamed of myself for deceiving her. Yet the lie had been told to prevent her from being frightened. Obviously. And then I had been sure that she must have known the truth later, when those brutes had attacked the house. During the day I kept on the alert, spending much of my time, as on the previous day, in the tower, but not a sign could I see of the swine creatures, nor hear any sound. Several times the thought had come to me that the things had, at last, left us. But up to this time I had refused to entertain the idea seriously. Now, however, I began to fear that there was no reason for hope. It would soon be 3 days since I had seen any of the things, capital T things. But still, I intended to use the utmost caution. For all that I could tell, this protracted silence might be a ruse to tempt me from the house, perhaps right into their arms. The thought of such a contingency was, alone, sufficient to make me circumspect. So it was that the 4th, 5th, and 6th days went by, quietly, without my making any attempt to leave the house. On the 6th day I had the pleasure of seeing Pepper once more upon his feet, and, though still very weak, he managed to keep me company during the whole of that day. End of chapter 10. Okay. End of chapter 10. It has been, well, it continues along, and we are just waiting for the next attack because we know it's going to happen. We check on our sister Mary, and she seems to be doing better. She's not so mortified to look at us. Pepper is healing slowly but nicely, doing a good job. Um, at the end of the chapter on the 6th day, Pepper is able to hang out with us for the full day, so that's great. Improvement. Our sister, we locked in her bedroom for her own safety, obviously, not because we are losing our sanity, but it's for her own safety because she tried to leave the house, and you can't do that because there's brutes out there. The swine people are out there, and that's terrifying, and we have to protect her. So, when we check on her, she seems to be doing a lot better, and she asks if she can go downstairs and make breakfast because she's hungry, and we allow it on the condition that she not try to get outside. Like, don't do it. Don't you dare. And she has like a little moment of pause, and then just agrees. And she's like, okay, I won't. And so she goes downstairs, she makes breakfast, all of these things. We, for the next several days, do our sweep of the house. Everything seems to be really quiet. We finally sleep in a bed, which we haven't been doing for the past couple days, because we are just so busy in making sure everything's good. And so yeah, it has been 6 days now since that attack. Oh, and also our sister still believes that Pepper was attacked by a wildcat, even though she endured the attack from the swine people, which makes me think that she didn't see them at all, which is interesting. Hmm. All right. Chapter 11. The Searching of the Gardens. How slowly the time went, and never a thing to indicate that any of the brutes still infested the gardens. It was on the 9th day that, finally, I decided to run the risk, if any there were, and sally out. With this purpose in view, I loaded one of the shotguns carefully, choosing it as being more deadly than a rifle at close quarters, and then, after a final scrutiny of the grounds, from the tower, I called Pepper to follow me, and made my way down to the basement. At the door I must confess to hesitating a moment. The thought of what might be awaiting me among the dark shrubberies was by no means calculated to encourage my resolution. It was, excuse me, it was but a second, though, and then I had drawn the bolts and was standing on the path outside the door. Pepper followed, stopping at the doorstep to sniff suspiciously, and carrying his nose up and down the jambs as though following a scent. Then, suddenly, he turned sharply and started to run here and there in semicircles and circles all around the door, finally returning to the threshold. Here he began again to nose about. Pepper. What do you smell, bud? Hitherto I had stood, watching the dog, yet all the time with half my gaze on the wild tangle of gardens stretching round me. Now I went toward him, and, bending down, examined the surface of the door, where he was smelling. I found that the wood was covered with a network of scratches, crossing and recrossing one another in inextricable confusion. In addition to this, I noticed that the doorposts themselves were gnawed in places. Beyond these I could find nothing, and so, standing up, I began to make the tour of the house wall. Pepper, as soon as I walked away, left the door and ran ahead, still nosing and sniffing as he went along. At times he stopped to investigate. Here it would be a bullet hole in the pathway, or perhaps a powder-stained wad. Anon, it might be a piece of torn sod or a disturbed patch of weedy path. But, save for such trifles, he found nothing. I observed him critically as he went along, and could discover nothing of uneasiness in his demeanor to indicate that he felt the nearness of any of the creatures. By this, I was assured that the gardens were empty, at least for the present, of those hateful things. Pepper could not be easily deceived, and it was a relief to feel that he would know and give me timely warning if there were any danger. Obviously, because Pepper's the best dog. Duh. Duh. Reaching the place where I had shot the first creature, I stopped. I made a careful scrutiny, but could see nothing. From there, I went on to where the great coping stone had fallen. It lay on its side, apparently just as it had been left when I shot the brute that was moving it. A couple of feet to the right of the nearer end was a great dent in the ground, showing where it had struck. The other end was still within the indentation, half in, half out. Going nearer, I looked at the stone more closely. What a huge piece of masonry it was, and that creature had moved it, single-handed, in its attempt to reach what lay below. I went round to the further end of the stone. Here I found that it was possible to see under it for a distance of nearly a couple of feet. Still, I could see nothing of the stricken creatures, and I felt much surprised. I had, as I have before said, guessed that the remains had been removed. Yet I could not conceive that it had been done so thoroughly as not to leave the certain sign beneath the stone indicative of their fate. I had seen several of the brutes struck down beneath it with such force that they must have been literally driven into the earth. And now, not a vestige of them was to be seen. Not even a bloodstain. I felt more puzzled than ever, as I turned the matter over in my mind, but could think of no plausible explanation, and so, finally, gave it up, as one of the many things that were unexplainable. From there, I transferred my attention to the study door. I could see now, even more plainly, the effects of the tremendous strain to which it had been subjected, and I marveled how, even with the support afforded by the props, it had withstood the attacks so well. There were no marks of blows, indeed, none had been given, but the door had been literally riven from its hinges by the application of enormous, silent force. One thing that I observed affected me profoundly. The head of one of the props had been driven right through the panel. This was, of itself, sufficient to show how huge an effort the creatures had made to break down the door, and how nearly they had succeeded. Leaving, I continued my tour around the house, finding little else of interest, save at the back where I came across the piece of piping I had torn from the wall, lying among the long grass underneath the broken window. Then I returned to the house, and, having rebolted the back door, went up to the tower. Here I spent the afternoon, reading and occasionally glancing down into the gardens. I had determined, if the night passed quietly, to go as far as the pit on the morrow. Perhaps I should be able to learn then something of what had happened. The day slipped away, and the night came and went much as the last few nights had gone. When I rose, the morning had broken, fine and clear, and I determined to put my project into action. During breakfast, I considered the matter carefully, after which I went to the study for my shotgun. In addition, I loaded and slipped into my pocket a small but heavy pistol. I quite understood that, if there were any danger, it lay in the direction of the pit, and I intended to be prepared. Leaving the study, I went down to the back door, followed by Pepper. Once outside, I took a quick survey of the surrounding gardens and then set off toward the pit. On the way, I kept a sharp outlook, holding my gun handily. Pepper was running ahead, I noticed, without any apparent hesitation. From this, I augured that there was no imminent danger to be apprehended, and I stepped out more quickly in his wake. He had reached the top of the pit now and was nosing his way along the edge. A minute later, I was beside him, looking down at the pit. For a moment, I could scarcely believe that it was the same place, so greatly was it changed. The dark, wooded ravine of a fortnight ago, with a foliage-hidden stream running sluggishly at the bottom, existed no longer. Instead, my eyes showed me a ragged chasm, partly filled with a gloomy lake of turbid water. Gross. All one side of the ravine was stripped of underwood, showing the bare rock. A little to my left, the side of the pit appeared to have collapsed altogether, forming a deep V-shaped cleft in the face of the rocky cliff. This rift ran from the upper edge of the ravine nearly down to the water and penetrated into the pit side to a distance of some 40 feet. Its opening was, at least, 6 yards across, and from this it seemed to taper into about 2. But what attracted my attention more than even the stupendous split itself was a great hole some distance down the cleft, and right in the angle of the V. It was clearly defined, and not unlike an arched doorway in shape, though, lying as it did in the shadow, I could not see it very distinctly. The opposite side of the pit still retained its verdure, but so torn in places and everywhere covered with dust and rubbish, that it was hardly distinguishable as such. My first impression that there had been a landslip was, I began to see, not sufficient of itself to account for all the changes I witnessed. And the water? I turned suddenly, for I had become aware that, somewhere to my right, there was a noise of running water. I could see nothing. But now that my attention had been caught, I distinguished easily that it came from somewhere at the east end of the pit. Slowly, I made my way in that direction, the sound growing plainer as I advanced, until in a little I stood right above it. Even then, I could not perceive the cause until I knelt down and thrust my head over the cliff. Here the noise came up to me plainly, and I saw, below me, a torrent of clear water, issuing from a small fissure in the pit side and rushing down the rocks into the lake beneath. A little further along the cliff, I saw another, and, beyond that again, 2 smaller ones. These, then, would help to account for the quality for the quantity of water in the pit, and if the fall of rock and earth had blocked the outlet of the stream at the bottom, there was little doubt but that it was contributing a very large share. Yet I puzzled my head to account for the generally shaken appearance of the place, these streamlets, and that huge cleft further up the ravine. It seemed to me that more than the landslip was necessary to account for these. I could imagine an earthquake or a great explosion creating some such condition of affairs as existed, but of these there had been neither. Then I stood up quickly, remembering that crash, and the cloud of dust that had followed, directly rushing high into the air, but I shook my head unbelievingly. No, it must have been the noise of the falling rocks and earth I had heard. Of course the dust would fly naturally. Still, in spite of my reasoning, I had an uneasy feeling that this theory did not satisfy my sense of the probable. And yet, was any other that I could suggest likely to be half so plausible? Pepper had been sitting on the grass while I conducted my examination. Now, as I turned up the north side of the ravine, he rose and followed. Slowly, and keeping a careful watch in all directions, I made the circuit of the pit, but found little else that I had not already seen. From the west end, I could see the 4 waterfalls uninterruptedly. They were some considerable distance up from the surface of the lake, about 50 feet, I calculated. For a little while longer I loitered about, keeping my eyes and ears open, but still, without seeing or hearing anything suspicious. The whole place was wonderfully quiet. Indeed, save for the continuous murmur of the water at the top end, no sound of any description broke the silence. All this while, Pepper had shown no signs of uneasiness. This seemed, to me, to indicate that, for the time being at least, there was none of the swine creatures in the vicinity. So far as I could see, his attention appeared to have been taken chiefly with scratching and sniffing among the grass at the edge of the pit. At times, he would leave the edge and run along toward the house as though following invisible tracks, but, in all cases, returning after a few minutes. I had little doubt but that he was really tracing out the footsteps of the swine things, and the very fact that each one seemed to lead him back to the pit appeared to me a proof that the brutes had all returned whence they came. At noon, I went home for dinner. During the afternoon, I made a partial search of the gardens, accompanied by Pepper, but without coming upon anything to indicate the presence of the creatures. Once, as we made our way through the shrubberies, Pepper rushed in among some bushes with a fierce yelp. At that, I jumped back in sudden fright and threw my gun forward in readiness, only to laugh nervously as Pepper reappeared, chasing an unfortunate cat. Toward evening, I gave up the search and returned to the house. All at once, as we were passing a great clump of bushes on our right, Pepper disappeared, and I could hear him sniffing and growling among them in a suspicious manner. With my gun barrel, I parted the intervening shrubbery and looked inside. There was nothing to be seen, save that many of the branches were bent down and broken, as though some animal had made a lair there, at no very previous date. It was probably, I thought, one of the places occupied by some of the swine creatures on the night of the attack. Next day, I resumed my search through the gardens, but without result. By evening, I had been right through them, and now I knew, beyond the possibility of doubt, that there were no longer any of the things concealed about the place. Indeed, I have often thought since that I was correct in my earlier surmise that they had left soon after the attack. End of chapter 11. Okay, so we decide today's the day. Today's the day we are going to leave the house and see what's what. So we leave the house and we're looking around. We take Pepper with us because Pepper is best dog. Pepper is best Pepper. And we're walking about and we see on like one of the like entryways, like, or one of the knolls. Where do we see this? I don't know. We see something. But there's like bite marks and scratch marks like all over this. And so we're walking around, looking through the garden. Pepper doesn't really see anything, just sniffed at that one spot where we saw all of the bites and scratches, and was like being a cute little doggo to be like, Master, Master, I found something. But other than that, Pepper doesn't really see anything in the garden. And so we're walking around and we notice, like, okay, well, this thing is heavy and it's broken now. So that's just an indication of how strong these creatures are, and also how close they came to breaking in, which I hate that. I hate that so much. But we're looking around. We go to the edge of the wall where that pig was, well, that swine creature was moving the stones, and the stone is still where it was when we last saw it, but there's no bodies. There's no blood stains, and there's nothing really to indicate that they were here at all. And so we're like, cool. Let's keep venturing. We'll just keep looking around, looking for clues, all of those things. And so we go to the pit, and Pepper doesn't react. Pepper hasn't found anything. We are looking around. The pit looks normal. It's now just, full of water, and nothing is like super untoward or weird or anything like that. And Pepper is like running, like leaves and then comes back and then leaves and comes back. And so we just make the assumption that Pepper has found the like footsteps or the trails of these swine creatures. And because Pepper keeps coming back, we assume that the swine creatures have returned to the pit. Pepper does find, though, in the bushes that maybe a possible lair, but it looks like it had been abandoned and has not been returned to. And so we think that we're okay. We think that they have all left. And yeah, our assumptions were right. Excellent. High five us. The creatures have left soon after the attack, which, hooray, we're safe. Right? All right. Chapter 12. The Subterranean Pit. Another week came and went, during which I spent a great deal of my time about the pit mouth. I had come to the conclusion a few days earlier that the arched hole in the angle of the great rift was the place through which the swine things had made their exit, from some unholy place in the bowels of the world. How near the probable truth this was, I was to learn later. It may be easily understood that I was tremendously curious, though in a frightened way, to know to what infernal place that hole led, though, so far, the idea had not struck me seriously of making an investigation. I was far too much imbued with a sense of horror of the swine creatures to think of venturing willingly where there was any chance of coming into contact with them. Gradually, however, as time passed, this feeling grew insensibly less, so that when, a few days later, the thought occurred to me that it might be possible to clamber down and have a look into the hole, I was not so exceedingly averse to it as might have been imagined. Still, I do not think even then that I really intended to try any such foolhardy adventure. For all that I could tell, it might be certain death to enter that doleful-looking opening, and yet such is the pertinacity of human curiosity, that, at last, my chief desire was but to discover what lay beyond that gloomy entrance. Slowly, as the days slid by, my fear of the swine things became an emotion of the past, more an unpleasant, incredible memory than aught else. Thus a day came when, throwing thoughts and fancies adrift, I procured a rope from the house, and, having made it fast to a stout tree at the top of the rift, and some little distance back from the pit edge, let the other end down into the cleft, until it dangled right across the mouth of the dark hole. Then, cautiously, and with many misgivings as to whether it was not a mad act that I was attempting, I climbed slowly down, using the rope as a support, until I reached the hole. Here, still holding onto the rope, I stood and peered in. All was perfectly dark, and not a sound came to me. Yet, a moment later, it seemed that I could hear something. I held my breath and listened, but all was silent as the grave, and I breathed freely once more. At the same instant I heard the sound again. It was like a noise of laboring breathing, deep and sharp-drawn. For a short second I stood, petrified, not able to move, but now the sounds had ceased again, and I could hear nothing. As I stood there, anxiously, my foot dislodged a pebble, which fell inward, into the dark, with a hollow chink. At once the noise was taken up and repeated a score of times, each succeeding echo being fainter, and seeming to travel away from me, as though into remote distance. Then, as the silence fell again, I heard that stealthy breathing. For each respiration I made, I could hear an answering breath. The sounds appearing to be coming nearer, and then I heard several others, but faint and more distant. Why I did not grip the rope and spring out of danger, I cannot say. It was as though I had been paralyzed. I broke out into a profuse sweat and tried to moisten my lips with my tongue. My throat had gone suddenly dry, and I coughed huskily. It came back to me, in a dozen horrible, throaty tones, mockingly. I peered helplessly into the gloom, but still nothing showed. I had a strange, choky sensation, and again I coughed dryly. Again the echo took it up, rising and falling grotesquely, and dying slowly into a muffled silence. Then, suddenly, a thought came to me, and I held my breath. The other breathing stopped. I breathed again, and once more it recommenced. But now I no longer feared. I knew that the strange sounds were not made by any lurking swine creatures, but were simply the echo of my own respirations. Is this mirroring the same idea that we might be coming? We are the pigs? We are the pigs? Are we the pigs? Are we pigs? Are we the pigs? Yet I had received such a fright that I was glad to scramble up the rift and haul up the rope. I was far too shaken and nervous to think of entering that dark hole again, and so returned to the house. I felt more myself next morning, but even then I could not summon up sufficient courage to explore the place. All this time the water in the pit had been creeping slowly up, and now stood but a little below the opening. At the rate at which it was rising, it would be level with the floor in less than another week, and I realized that, unless I carried out my investigation soon, I should probably never do so at all. as the water would rise and rise until the opening itself was submerged. It may have been that this thought stirred me to act, but whatever it was, a couple days later saw me standing at the top of the cleft, fully equipped for the task. This time, I was resolved to conquer my shirking and go right through with the matter. With this intention I had brought, in addition to the rope, a bundle of candles, meaning to use them as a torch, also my double-barreled shotgun. In my belt I had a heavy horse pistol, loaded with buckshot. As before, I fastened the rope to the tree. Then, having tied my gun across my shoulders with a piece of stout cord, I lowered myself over the edge of the pit. At this movement, Pepper, who had been eyeing my actions watchfully, rose to his feet and ran to me with a half-bark, half-wail, it seemed to me, of warning. But I was resolved on my enterprise and bade him lie down. I would much have liked to take him with me, but this was next to impossible in the existing circumstances. As my face dropped level with the pit edge, he licked me right across the mouth, and then, seizing my sleeve between his teeth, began to pull back strongly. It's very evident that he did not want me to go. Yet, having made up my mind, I had no intention of giving up the attempt, and with a sharp word to Pepper to release me, I continued my descent, leaving the poor old fellow at the top, barking and crying like a forsaken pup. Carefully, I lowered myself from projection to projection. I knew that a slip might mean a wedding. WETTING, not like we're gonna get married. Reaching the entrance, I let go of the rope and untied the gun from my shoulders. Then, with a last look at the sky, which I noticed was clouding over rapidly, I went forward a couple of paces so as to be shielded from the wind, and lit one of the candles. Holding it above my head and grasping my gun firmly, I began to move on slowly, throwing my glances in all directions. For the first minute, I could hear the melancholy sound of Pepper's growling coming down to me. Gradually, as I penetrated further into the darkness, it grew fainter, until in a little while I could hear nothing. The path tended downward somewhat and to the left. Thence it kept on, still running to the left, until I found that it was leading me right in the direction of the house. Very cautiously, I moved onward, stopping every few steps to listen. I had gone, perhaps, 100 yards, when, suddenly, it seemed to me that I caught a faint sound somewhere along the passage behind. With my heart thudding heavily, I listened. The noise grew plainer and appeared to be approaching rapidly. I could hear it distinctly now. It was the soft padding of running feet. In the first moments of fright, I stood irresolute, not knowing whether to go forward or backward. Then, with a sudden realization of the best thing to do, I backed up to the rocky wall on my right and, holding the candle above my head, waited, gun in hand, cursing my foolhardy curiosity for bringing me into such a strait. I had not long to wait, but a few seconds, before two eyes reflected back from the gloom the rays of my candle. I raised my gun, using my right hand only, and aimed quickly. Even as I did so, something leapt out of the darkness with a blustering bark of joy that woke the echoes like thunder. It was Pepper. How he had contrived to scramble down the cleft I could not conceive. As I brushed my hand nervously over his coat, I noticed that he was dripping, and concluded that he must have tried to follow me and fallen into the water, from which he would not find it very difficult to climb. Having waited a minute or so to steady myself, I proceeded along the way, Pepper following, quietly. I was curiously glad to have the old fellow with me. He was company, and somehow, with him at my heels, I was less afraid. Also, I knew how quickly his keen ears would detect the presence of any unwelcome creature, should there be such amid the darkness that wrapped us. For some minutes we went slowly along, the path still leading straight toward the house. Soon, I concluded, we should be standing right beneath it, did the path but carry far enough. I led the way, cautiously, for another 50 yards or so. Then I stopped and held the light high, and reason enough I had to be thankful that I did so, for there, not 3 paces forward, the path vanished, and in place showed a hollow blackness that sent sudden fear through me. Very cautiously, I crept forward and peered down, but could see nothing. Then I crossed to the left of the passage to see whether there might be any continuation of the path. Here, right against the wall, I found that a narrow track, some 3 feet wide, led onward. Carefully, I stepped onto it, but had not gone far before I regretted venturing thereon. For, after a few paces, the already narrow way resolved itself into a mere ledge, with, on the one side, the solid, unyielding rock towering up in a great wall to the unseen roof, and, on the other, that yawning chasm. I could not help reflecting how helpless I was. Should I be attacked there, with no room to turn, and where even the recoil of my weapon might be sufficient to drive me headlong into the depths below? To my great relief, a little further on, the track suddenly broadened out again to its original breadth. Gradually, as I went onward, I noticed that the path trended steadily to the right, and so, after some minutes, I discovered that I was not going forward, but simply circling the huge abyss. I had, evidently, come to the end of the great passage. 5 minutes later, I stood on the spot from which I had started, having been completely round what I guessed now to be a vast pit, the mouth of which must be at least 100 yards across. For some little time I stood there, lost in perplexing thought. What does it all mean? Was the cry that had begun to reiterate through my brain. A sudden idea struck me, and I searched round for a piece of stone. Presently I found a bit of rock, about the size of a small loaf. Sticking the candle upright in a crevice of the floor, I went back from the edge somewhat, and, taking a short run, launched the stone forward into the chasm, my idea being to throw it far enough to keep it clear of the sides. Then I stooped forward and listened. But though I kept perfectly quiet for at least a full minute, no sound came back to me from out of the dark. I knew then that the depth of the hole must be immense, for the stone, had it struck nothing, was large enough to have set the echoes of that weird place whispering for an indefinite period. Even as it was, the cavern had given back the sounds of my footfalls multitudinously. The place was awesome, and I would willingly have retraced my steps and left the mysteries of its solitudes unsolved. Only, to do so meant admitting defeat. Then a thought came to me, to try to get a view of the abyss. It occurred to me that, if I placed my candles round the edge of the hole, I should be able to get at least some dim sight of the place. I found on counting that I had brought 15 candles in the bundle, my first intention having been, as I have already said, to make a torch of the lot. These I proceeded to place round the pit mouth, with an interval of about 20 yards between each. Having completed the circle, I stood in the passage and endeavored to get an idea of how the place looked. But I discovered immediately that they were totally insufficient for my purpose. They did little more than make the gloom visible. One thing they did, however, and that was, they confirmed my opinion of the size of the opening, and although they showed me nothing that I wanted to see, yet the contrast they afforded to the heavy darkness pleased me curiously. It was as though 15 tiny stars shone through the subterranean night. Then, even as I stood, Pepper gave a sudden howl that was taken up by the echoes and repeated with ghastly variations, dying away slowly. With a quick movement, I held aloft the one candle that I had kept and glanced down at the dog. At the same moment, I seemed to hear a noise, like a diabolical chuckle, rise up from the hitherto silent depths of the pit. I started. Then I recollected that it was probably the echo of Pepper's howl. Pepper had moved. Patiently waiting for this stupid fucking microphone. You ready? You good? Good lord. Alright, nobody fucking knows where I left off. Say it again. Then, even as I stood, Pepper gave a sudden howl that was taken up by the echoes and repeated with ghastly variations, dying away slowly. With a quick movement, I held aloft the one candle that I had kept and glanced down at the dog. At the same moment, I seemed to hear a noise, like a diabolical chuckle, rise up from the hitherto silent depths of the pit. I started. Then I recollected that it was, probably, the echo of Pepper's howl. Pepper had moved away from me, up the passage a few steps. He was nosing along the rocky floor, and I thought I heard him lapping. I went toward him, holding the candle low. As I moved, I heard my boot go sop, sop, and the light was reflected from something that glistened and crept past my feet, swiftly, toward the pit. I bent lower and looked, then gave vent to an expression of surprise. From somewhere, higher up the path, a stream of water was running quickly in the direction of the great opening and growing in size every second. Again, Pepper gave vent to that deep-drawn howl, and running at me, seized my coat and attempted to drag me up the path toward the entrance. With a nervous gesture, I shook him off and crossed quickly over to the left-hand wall. If anything were coming, I was going to have the wall at my back. Then, as I stared anxiously up the pathway, my candle caught a gleam far up the passage. At the same moment, I became conscious of a murmurous roar that grew louder and filled the whole cavern with deafening sound. From the pit came a deep, hollow echo like the sob of a giant. Then I had sprung to one side, onto the narrow ledge that ran round the abyss, and, turning, saw a great wall of foam sweep past me and leap tumultuously into the waiting chasm. A cloud of spray burst over me, extinguishing my candle and wetting me to the skin. I still held my gun. The 3 nearest candles went out, but the further ones gave only a short flicker. After the first rush, the flow of water eased down to a steady stream, maybe a foot in depth, though I could not see this until I had procured one of the lighted candles and, with it, started to reconnoiter. Pepper had, fortunately, followed me as I leapt for the ledge, and now, very much subdued, kept close behind. A short examination showed me that the water reached right across the passage, and was running at a tremendous rate. Already, even as I stood there, it had deepened. I could make only a guess at what had happened. Evidently, the water in the ravine had broken into the passage by some means. If that were the case, it would go on increasing in volume until I should find it impossible to leave the place. The thought was frightening. It was evident that I must make my exit as hurriedly as possible. Taking my gun by the stock, I sounded the water. It was a little under knee-deep. The noise it made, plunging down into the pit, was deafening. Then, with a call to Pepper, I stepped out into the flood, using the gun as my staff. Instantly, the water boiled up over my knees and nearly to the tops of my thighs with the speed at which it was racing. For one short moment, I nearly lost my footing, but the thought of what lay behind stimulated me to a fierce endeavor, and step by step, I made headway. Of Pepper, I knew nothing at first. I had all I could do to keep on my legs, and was overjoyed when he appeared beside me. He was wading manfully along. He is a big dog, with longish, thin legs, and I suppose the water had less grasp on them than upon mine. Anyway, he managed a great deal better than I did, going ahead of me like a guide, and wittingly, or otherwise, helping somewhat to break the force of the water. On we went, step by step, struggling and grasping until somewhere about 100 yards had been safely traversed. Then, whether it was because I was taking less care or that there was a slippery place on the rocky floor, I cannot say. But suddenly I slipped and fell on my face. Instantly the water leapt over me in a cataract, hurling me down toward the bottomless hole at a frightful speed. Frantically, I struggled, but it was impossible to get a footing. I was helpless, gasping and drowning. All at once, something gripped my coat and brought me to a standstill. It was Pepper. Missing me, he must have raced back through the dark turmoil to find me, and then caught and held me until I was able to get to my feet. I have a dim recollection of having seen momentarily the gleams of several lights, but of this I have never been quite sure. If my impressions are correct, I must have been washed down to the very brink of that awful chasm before Pepper managed to bring me to a standstill. And the lights, of course, could only have been the distant flames of the candles I had left burning. But, as I have said, I am not by any means sure. My eyes were full of water, and I had been badly shaken. And there was I, without my helpful gun, without light, and sadly confused, with the water deepening, depending solely upon my old friend Pepper to help me out of that hellish place. I was facing the torrent. Naturally, it was the only way in which I could have sustained my position a moment, for even old Pepper could not have held me long against that terrific strain without assistance, however blind, from me. Perhaps a minute passed, during which it was touch and go with me. Then, gradually, I recommenced my torturous way up the passage, and so began the grimmest fight with death, from which ever I hope to emerge victorious. Slowly, furiously, almost hopelessly, I strove, and that faithful Pepper led me, dragged me upward and onward, until at last ahead I saw a gleam of blessed light. It was the entrance. Only a few yards further, and I reached the opening with the water surging and boiling hungrily around my loins. And now I understood the cause of the catastrophe. It was raining heavily, literally in torrents. The surface of the lake was level with the bottom of the opening, nay, more than level. It was above it. Evidently, the rain had swollen the lake and caused this premature rise, for, at the rate the ravine had been filling, it would not have reached the entrance for a couple more days. Luckily, the rope by which I had descended was streaming into the opening upon the inrushing waters. Seizing the end, I knotted it securely round Pepper's body, then, summoning up the last remnant of my strength, I commenced to swarm up the side of the cliff. I reached the pit edge, in the last stage of exhaustion. Yet, I had to make one more effort, and haul Pepper into safety. Slowly and wearily, I hauled on the rope. Once or twice it seemed that I should have to give up, for Pepper is a weighty dog, and I was utterly done. Yet, to let go would have meant certain death to the old fellow, and the thought spurred me to greater exertions. I have but a very hazy remembrance of the end. I recall pulling through moments that lagged strangely. I have also some recollection of seeing Pepper's muzzle appearing over the pit edge after what seemed an indefinite period of time. Then all grew suddenly dark. End of chapter 12. All right, so chapter 12 was a doozy. That was a long one. So we decide to go into the pit. And so we go out there and we look about and we don't really see anything. Like the pit is like, it's a pit. It's a pit. But we go out there, we look around and we're like, okay, well, we obviously need to go into it. Right? So the next day we get everything ready. We have rope, we bring a bunch of candles and our shotgun and another gun, and everything has ammo, and we're ready to go. So we go out to the pit and we lower ourselves down. Pepper has followed us and we're like, Pepper, no, don't you dare follow me. And so we like kiss Pepper goodbye. I actually don't remember if we kiss Pepper goodbye. I don't think we do, but we should have. We kiss Pepper goodbye and then we descend into the pit. And so we are in this huge cavern and we just can't really see. And so we're following this path, and as we're following this path, it sort of like moves and gets really, really narrow. And so we stay against the wall and we go around, and then we realize that we're not going, like, we're just circling back to where we were. And in the middle is this huge depth that we can't see at all. And we can't hear anything at all. So we decide to use the candles. And so we put candles all the way around. And we still don't see anything. I think we have a really cool line where it just says that it like illuminates the gloom more, like so that you can see it better, which I love that. That's kind of cool. We hear something. Oh, I think I might have mixed up like the order of things, but we hear something and we're like, what is this? And so we raise our shotgun and we have like our candle, and it's just Pepper. Pepper has followed us with a good puppums. And so then we hear something else and it sounds like water. And water just starts rushing in. And so we try to gather as much as we can and we try to leave, and we're doing okay. We're having a hard time. moving, and Pepper seems to be doing fine. But we slip and we like smack our face into the ground and we start being washed away by this torrent. And good boy Pepper comes and saves us. Pepper is the best. Um, and so then we make it up, but like we make it out of the little cavern and we notice that like, oh, well, no wonder there's so much water. It is raining. It is like super, super pouring, and the water level is like level with the entrance. And it's like, okay, cool. No wonder it was just like pouring into this little cavern that we were in. But Pepper didn't make it up. So we like tie rope around Pepper and like bring Pepper up because obviously Pepper is the best. And yeah, I think that's it. I think maybe yeah. And then we sort of like pass out because of exertion. Sort of. We just sort of pass out. All right. Chapter 13. The Trap in the Great Cellar. Oh, something else that we noticed is that the pit looks also like it goes towards our home. Like there it looks like there's like a tunnel that leads to it. That's cool. Nothing nothing scary about that. Chapter 13. The Trap in the Great Cellar. I suppose I must have swooned, for the next thing I remember I opened my eyes and all was dusk. I was lying on my back with one leg doubled under the other, and Pepper was licking my ears. I felt horribly stiff, and my leg was numb from the knee downward. For a few minutes I lay thus, in a dazed condition. Then, slowly, I struggled to a sitting position and looked about me. It had stopped raining, but the trees still dripped dismally. From the pit came a continuous murmur of running water. I felt cold and shivery. My clothes were sodden and I ached all over. Very slowly the life came back into my numbed leg, and after a little, I essayed to stand up. This I managed at the second attempt, but I was very tottery and most and particularly weak. It seemed to me that I was going to be ill, and I made shift to stumble my way toward the house. My steps were erratic, and my head confused. At each step I took, sharp pains shot through my limbs. I had gone, perhaps, some 30 paces when a cry from Pepper drew my attention, and I turned stiffly toward him. The old dog was trying to follow me, but could come no further, owing to the rope with which I had hauled him up being still tied round his body, the other end not having been unfastened from the tree. For a moment I fumbled with the knots weakly, but they were wet and hard, and I could do nothing. Then I remembered my knife, and in a minute the rope was cut. How I reached the house I scarcely know, and of the days that followed I remember still less. Of one thing I am certain, that, had it not been for my sister's untiring love and nursing, I had not been writing at this moment. When I recovered my senses, it was to find that I had been in bed for nearly 2 weeks. Yet another week passed before I was strong enough to totter out into the gardens. Even then, I was not able to walk so far as the pit. I would have liked to ask my sister how high the water had risen, but felt it was wiser not to mention the subject to her. Indeed, since then I have made a rule never to speak to her about the strange things that happen in this great old house. It was not until a couple of days later that I managed to get across to the pit. There I found that, in my few weeks' absence, there had been wrought a wondrous change. Instead of the 3 parts-filled ravine, I looked out upon a great lake, whose placid surface reflected the light coldly. The water had risen to within 6 feet of the pit edge. Only in one part was the lake disturbed, and that was above the place where, far down under the silent waters, yawned the entrance to the vast underground pit. Here there was a continuous bubbling, and occasionally a curious sort of sobbing gurgle would find its way up from the depth. Beyond these there was nothing to tell of the things that were hidden beneath. As I stood there, it came to me how wonderfully things had worked out. The entrance to the place whence the swine creatures had come were sealed up by a power that made me feel there was nothing more to fear from them. And yet, with the feeling, there was a sensation that, now, I should never learn anything further of the place from which those dreadful things had come. It was completely shut off and concealed from human curiosity forever. Strange, in the knowledge of that underground hellhole, how opposite has been the naming of the pit. One wonders how it originated and when. Naturally, one concludes that the shape and depth of the ravine would suggest the name pit. Yet, is it not possible that it has, all along, held a deeper significance, a hint? Could one but have guessed of the greater, more stupendous pit that lies far down in the earth beneath this old house? Under this house? Even now, the idea is strange and terrible to me. For I have proved beyond doubt that the pit yawns right below the house, which is evidently supported, somewhere above the center of it, upon a tremendous arched roof of solid rock. It happened in this wise, that, having occasion to go down to the cellars, the thought occurred to me to pay a visit to the great vault, where the trap is situated, and to see whether everything was as I had left it. Reaching the place, I walked slowly up the center until I came to the trap. There it was, with the stones piled upon it, just as I had seen it last. I had a lantern with me, and the idea came to me that now would be a good time to investigate whatever lay under the great oak slab. Placing the lantern on the floor, I tumbled the stones off the trap and, grasping the ring, pulled the door open. As I did so, the cellar became filled with the sound of a murmurous thunder that rose from far below. At the same time, a damp wind blew up into my face, bringing with it a load of fine spray. Therewith, I dropped the trap hurriedly, and a half-frightened feeling of wonder. For a moment I stood puzzled. I was not particularly afraid. The haunting fear of the swine things had left me long ago, but I was certainly nervous and astonished. Then a sudden thought possessed me, and I raised the wondrous door with a feeling of excitement. Leaving it standing upon its end, I seized the lantern and, kneeling down, thrust it into the opening. As I did so, the moist wind and spray drove in my eyes, making me unable to see for a few moments. Even when my eyes were clear, I could distinguish nothing below me save darkness and whirling spray. Seeing that it was useless to expect to make out anything with the light so high, I felt in my pockets for a piece of twine with which to lower it further into the opening. Even as I fumbled, the lantern slipped from my fingers and hurtled down into the darkness. For a brief instant, I watched its fall and saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam some 80 or 100 feet below me. Then it was gone. My sudden surmise was correct, and now I knew the cause of the wet and noise. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap, which opened right above it, and the moisture was the spray rising from the water falling into the depths. In an instant I had an explanation of certain things that had hitherto puzzled me. Now I could understand why the noises on the first night of the invasion had seemed to rise directly from under my feet. And the chuckle that had sounded when first I opened the trap. Evidently some of the swine things must have been right beneath me. Another thought struck me. Were the creatures all drowned? Would they drown? I remember how unable I had been to find any traces to show that my shooting had been really fatal. Had they life as we understood life, or were they ghouls? These thoughts flashed through my brain as I stood in the dark, searching my pockets for matches. I had the box in my hand now, and striking a light, I stepped to the trap door and closed it. Then I piled the stones back upon it, after which I made my way out from the cellars. And so, I suppose the water goes on, thundering down into that bottomless hell pit. Sometimes I have an inexplicable desire to go down to the great cellar, open the trap, and gaze into the impenetrable, spray-damp darkness. At times the desire becomes almost overpowering in its intensity. It is not mere curiosity that prompts me, but more as though some unexplained influence were at work. Still, I never go, and intend to fight down the strange longing and crush it, even as I would the unholy thought of self-destruction. This idea of some intangible force being exerted may seem reasonless, but my instinct warns me that it is not so. In these things, reason seems to be less to be trusted than instinct. One thought there is, in closing, that impresses itself upon me with ever-growing insistence. It is that I live in a very strange house, a very awful house, and I have begun to wonder whether I am doing wisely in staying here. Yet, if I left, where could I go? And still obtain the solitude and the sense of her presence that alone make my old life bearable. Her presence? Excuse me. That was the end of the chapter. End of chapter 13. Okay, there is a footnote right after her presence, and it says, an apparently unmeaning interpolation can find no previous mention to this matter. It becomes clearer, however, in the light of succeeding incidents. Editor. Here the writing becomes undecipherable owing to the damaged condition of this part of the manuscript. Below I print such fragments that as legible. The severest scrutiny has not enabled me to decipher more of the damaged portion of the manuscript. It commences to be legible again with the chapter titled "The Noise in the Night." Okay, so we have like an in-book footnote. Okay, so we went down into the cellar. Well, we went into the cellar and was like, let's have a look at this pit again. And so we open the trapdoor, we take all the rocks off, we open the trapdoor, we hold up our lantern, and yeah, it's dark down there. It's dark. And so we get some twine and we lower it down, and it's dark. But it looks like the pit is indeed connected to the house by this trapdoor. So we go through like, oh, okay, so that's why I heard the laughing. That's why, this happened, all of these things. And then we're also questioning like where the swine things went. Like, were they drowned? Is that what happened? Like when the water came in? Do they die? Is life the same for them as it is for us? And so then we're like, okay, well, why don't I just move? Well, these are the reasons why I can't. And then we mention her presence. Who is her? Is her the sister? That can't be right. Is her like a past love? Who is her? Is the sister real? Is the sister real? Is she a ghost? I don't know. Okay. Chapter 14. We'll do one more. The Sea of Sleep. Love that. The Sea of Sleep. For a considerable period after the last incidents, which I have narrated in my diary, I had serious thoughts of leaving this house, and might have done so, but for the great and wonderful thing of which I am about to write. How well I was advised in my heart when I stayed on here, spite of those visions and sights of unknown and unexplainable things. For, had I not stayed, then I had not seen again the face of her that I loved. Yes, though few know it, none now save my sister Mary, I have loved and, ah me, lost. I would write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like the tearing of old wounds. Yet, after that which has happened, what need have I to care? For she had come to me out of the unknown. Strangely, she warned me passionately against this house, begged me to leave it, but admitted, when I questioned her, that she could not have come to me had I been elsewhere. Yet, in spite of this, still she warned me earnestly, telling me that it was a place long ago given over to evil, and under the power of grim laws of which none here have knowledge. And I just asked her again whether she would come to me elsewhere, and she could only stand silent. It was thus that I came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she termed it in her dear speech with me. I had stayed up in my study reading, and must have dozed over the book. Suddenly, I awoke and sat upright with a start. For a moment I looked round with a puzzled sense of something unusual. There was a misty look about the room, giving a curious softness to each table and chair and furnishing. Gradually the mistiness increased, growing as it were out of nothing. Then, slowly, a soft, white light began to glow in the room. The flames of the candle shone through it palely. I looked from side to side and found that I could still see each piece of furniture, but in a strangely unreal way, more as though the ghost of each table and chair had taken the place of the solid article. Gradually, as I looked, I saw them fade and fade until slowly they resolved into nothingness. Now I looked again at the candles. They shone wanly, and even as I watched, they grew more unreal, and so vanished. The room was filled now with a soft yet luminous white twilight, like a gentle mist of light. Beyond this I could see nothing. Even the walls had vanished. Presently, I became conscious that a faint, continuous sound pulsed through the silence that wrapped me. I listened intently. It grew more distinct, until it appeared to me that I harked to the breathings of some great sea. I cannot tell how long a space passed thus, but after a while it seemed that I could see through the mistiness, and, slowly, I became aware that I was standing upon the shore of an immense and silent sea. This shore was smooth and long, vanishing to right and left of me in extreme distances. In front swam a still immensity of sleeping ocean. At times it seemed to me that I caught a faint glimmer of light under its surface, but of this I could not be sure. Behind me rose up, to an extraordinary height, gaunt, black cliffs. Overhead, the sky was of a uniform cold gray color, the whole place being lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire that swam a little above the far horizon and shed a foam-like light above the quiet waters. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea, an intense stillness prevailed. For a long while I stayed there, looking out across its strangeness. Then, as I stared, it seemed that a bubble of white foam floated up out of the depths, and then, even now I know not how it was, I was looking upon, nay, looking into the face of her. Aye, into her face, into her soul. And she looked back at me with such a comingly of joy and sadness that I ran toward her, blindly, crying strangely to her in a very agony of remembrance, of terror, and of hope to come to me. Yet, spite of my crying, she stayed out there upon the sea and only shook her head sorrowfully. But in her eyes was the old earthlight of tenderness that I had come to know, before all things, ere we were parted. At her perverseness I grew desperate, and essayed to wade out to her, yet, though I would, I could not. Some invisible barrier held me back, and I was fain to stay where I was and cry out to her in the fullness of my soul, "Oh, my darling, but could say no more for very intensity. And at that she came over, swiftly, and touched me, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet, when I reached out my hands to her, she put me from her with tenderly stern hands, and I was abashed. Okay, so we're getting some more visions. So late at night, everything starts to get misty, and like everything is just fading from existence, which, cool. Love that. And the walls have faded, and we just see this enormous ocean, but it's not making any noise. And then we see her, the woman that we being the narrator, loved. And we call out to her, and she comes over to us, and she grabs us sternly. And now this next part are just fragments. It is the legible portions of the mutilated pages. Interesting. Through tears, noise of eternity in my ears, we parted. She whom I love, oh my God. It was great time dazed, and then I was alone in the blackness of the night. I knew that I journeyed back once more to the known universe. Presently I emerged from the enormous darkness. I had come among the stars. Vast time. The sun, far and remote. I entered into the gulf that separates our system from the outer suns. As I sped across the dividing dark, I watched. Steadily, the ever-growing brightness the size of our sun. Once, I glanced back to the stars and saw them shift, as it were, in my wake, against the mighty background of night. So vast was the speed of my passing spirit. I drew nigher to our system, and now I could see the shine of Jupiter. Later I distinguished the cold, blue gleam of the earthlight. I had a moment of bewilderment. All about the sun there seemed to be bright objects moving in rapid orbits. Inward, nigh to the savage glory of the sun, there circled two darting points of light, and further off there flew a blue, shining speck that I knew to be the earth. It encircled the sun in a space that seemed to be no more than an earth minute. Nearer, with great speed, I saw the radiances of Jupiter and Saturn spinning with incredible swiftness in huge orbits. And ever I drew more nigh and looked out upon this strange sight, the visible circling of the planets about the mother sun. It was as though time had been annihilated for me, so that a year was no more to my unfleshed spirit than is a moment to an earthbound soul. The speed of the planets appeared to increase, and presently I was watching the sun, all ringed about with hair-like circles of different colored fire. The paths of the planets hurtling at mighty speed about the central flame. The sun grew vast, as though it leapt to meet me, and now I was within the circle of the outer planets, and flitting swiftly toward the place where the earth, glimmering through the blue splendor of its orbit, as though a fiery mist encircled the sun at a monstrous speed. End of chapter 14 and end of the fragments. Okay, so the fragments are silly. It looks like, so we're not getting a full picture, which is interesting, and the picture that we are given is weird. It's weird. We're having almost like an out-of-body experience and traveling through this outer realm. Excuse me. Excuse me. But that is where we're going to end it tonight. We will pick up right where we left off next time with chapter 15, and it'll be great. As I mentioned before, this is a re-recording. Lost the stream for this one. Next week is also going to be a re-recording. So, thank you all for sitting here. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Bye.